What's up, YouTube?
It's Radio Free Infamous, episode 330, talking about Branikald, section
Number 3.
covering the final 4 Branikald albums released in 2000 and 2001, which is cool because not only does it mean that we get to
finish the fight,
but also it means we get to talk about the most underrated and under-discussed aspect of Branikald's discography, which means that this episode is about stuff I would consider to be triple underrated. Because one, Branikald, Russian black metal, as far as your average dork funeral listener goes, not really something that comes up that often in casual black metal conversation. 2, Branikald in particular plays some stuff that is super raw and super lo-fi and super towards the
nobody knows who stole the chicken
end of the political spectrum. So there's another barrier to entry for these guys being part of a standard black metal conversation at a show. Even more so than that,
Number 3.
this particular set of albums, even the Branikald fan base, the diehards, seems to be split in their reception of them. A whole lot of people that are really into the other Branikald albums cannot stand this era of Branikald, but I myself am not one of those people, because I actually think the last third or so of Branikald's discography contains some of their coolest stuff, and I believe that Cauldre did a really good job innovating his sound on these last few albums without sacrificing the essence of what made Branikald Branikald. And hopefully I'll be able to convince you of that over the course of this episode. So the first album from Branikald Era 3 is called,
Струн натянутых вдохновения сталь.
fucking what?
Струн натянутых вдохновения сталь.
너는 산이야 바다야?
Yeah, no kidding. Usually I try to attempt to pronounce stuff in foreign languages on this show, but I ain't even touching that one. Apparently in English it translates to something like the strings of inspiration sing, but my copy of the CD renames the album to Ulveger, which is a lot easier to say, so we're just gonna call it that. This one came out at some undefined point in the year 2000, and I kind of consider it to be the first of this series of albums just because it has a whole lot in common with the prior and my personal favorite Branikald album, Kladvazor, and it sort of functions as a bridge between that era of Branikald and the newer stuff. And much like the prior album, it starts out with a wholly ambient track that primarily consists of just that particular musical phrase repeated for most of its runtime, with new layers of sound being added and occasional extra notes being thrown in, but generally it's all just that. So it's very primitive and elemental and meditative, whereas if you remember the ambient track on the Hladvazor album was really chaotic and amorphous and it was hard to figure out where it began or end. This one's incredibly concrete. One might even call it Apollonian, whereas the ambient track opening Hladvazor was very Dionysian. In fact, so complete is this track's devotion to the god of structuralism in art, Apollo, that it doesn't even really change up its melodic skeleton until right at the end, where it does a little something like then it goes into this thing where it just kind of repeats those 2 chords over and over until it blurs out into chaos and the fade out. And honestly, I would say it's one of the better Branikald ambient tracks, even if it's very different than the much more amorphous and chaotic kind of stuff he usually does in that medium. From there, it goes into the black metal, and it sounds like fucking Branikald. And if you're unfamiliar with what Branikald sounds like, you really should listen to the prior 2 episodes in this series. But this particular song, Energi Ansus, by the energy of Ansus, that being a Viking rune, gives you a pretty decent summation of what's going on. Incredibly ambient, binary snare hi-hat drum beats over which you have these floating ambient tremolo picked frosty guitar riffs and very harsh impassioned vocals, and a melody that kind of harkens back to the ambient track that introed the album whilst developing its melodic concept a little bit further. But as this album continues onwards, you really start to hear why I consider this to be sort of a transitional album for Branikald, to where he's gradually moving towards a new style. This becomes most notable in terms of the album's rhythmic component, wherein the drums abandon that fast sort of hi-hat snare alternation in favor of a much more rollicking, sort of almost hard rockish beat that you might hear from Absurd or another rack band like that. But not only that, the guitar riffs themselves alter their DNA to fit this more percussive mode, where you have these shorter form melodies that sort of bounce off of each heavy snare drum hit, in a much more concise approach to Branikald style songwriting. And as you're hearing right now, another innovation made by the drum section would be the implementation of double bass drums, which, at least as far as my brain can remember, weren't ever really part of Branikald's musical toolbox up until this release, but would also become very important going forwards, particularly on their final album, which we're still a couple albums out from. So Ulveigr is sort of got one foot in the classic era of Branikald and one foot in the more modern era of Branikald. The follow-up album, Razduvaya Ting Vetrov, or Rising Up the Thing of Winds, in this case, thing doesn't mean, the hand from the Addams Family. We're talking about the thing as in the all thing, a gathering of Norsemen, wherein they get together, make political decisions, swap stories, quaff a whole bunch of mead, and generally just hang out doing their Norseman thing. Whole lot of that going on. But apparently all the different spirits of the wind and air have gotten together to create their own thing up in the cosmic ether, which is a very Branikald sort of concept. And they have bestowed upon us this third to last Branikald album, which, depending on who you ask amongst a lot of the older Branikald faithful, is seen as the last good Branikald album. Now, obviously, I don't agree with that, but I do think this is a pretty sick album. The one major issue with it, at least on my copy of it, when you listen to it, it seems like the left channel audio is much louder than the right channel audio, but then when you actually open up the waveform, the right channel audio is the one that actually is louder, but it's mostly just like bass frequencies on a very trebly sort of black metal album. So it creates this weird illusion that all of the album is emanating from your left side. I've done my best to try and correct for that in the samples of it that I'm going to play, but just be aware of that if it sounds funny to you. From the very first black metal track after the ambient intro, you can tell that this is building on the more concise style of Ulveigr, utilizing that much more percussive approach to riffing with that very rollicking, folky sort of rack beat. And indeed, the first song on this album is mostly just based around that admittedly very catchy sort of black metal riff, to the point where, at least in some aspects, this can almost be seen as the punk Branikald album. At least until this happens, about halfway through the runtime of the first black metal track on the album, the drums drop out entirely. We have the classic Branikald unraveling style song ending section, except on this song and on the other couple black metal songs in this album, it takes up at least half of each of those songs' runtimes, indicating that, yeah, the black metal component of this album is going to be a lot more concise and punky, but this album is also going to lean way more heavily into the ambient direction. And the rest of the album definitely bears this out, given that it's got 6 songs on it. 3 of them are black metal songs with very punkish beginnings and then extended ambient black metal outros. The other 3 songs are entirely ambient. And let me tell you, the ambient music component of this Branikald album might be the most developed that it has ever sounded for them, at least from a texture standpoint. What I mean by that is there's far more variety in instrumental voices during the ambient sections on this album. Like right now, the clean guitar is by far the most recognizably guitar-sounding sort of clean guitar sound they've ever utilized on an ambient track. But then as the track unfolds onwards, you get this really weird, echoey, almost reversed, ghostly sounding sort of emanation coming in the background. Way more variety and texture than we're used to from Branikald, but also a good deal more forward motion than we're used to hearing from their long ambient songs. As this one actually has multiple distinct sections to it, like this one right here where that clean guitar has gone away entirely in favor of that odd, again, very ghostly sounding sort of drone. I feel like if you enjoyed the ambient stuff on Hladvazor, you really owe it to yourself to check out this album just to see how far he can push the ambient sound. And eventually he even brings back the clean guitar playing that same phrase that the weirdo guitar was playing, but now with a completely different atmosphere given how massively the guitar sound changed over the course of that track. Rising Up the Thing of Winds is definitely one of the least accessible sort of Branikald albums due to the very raw production, the weird audio issues I detailed earlier, and the fact that it leans so heavily into ambient music, but I find it to be one of the most rewarding Branikald Branikald albums if you're really willing to dive into the going-ons musically of its conception. So, now we're into the final section of Branikald's discography, the part that a lot of earlier Branikald fans cannot stand. Tingo nashlas dayas raspri, or ravished by the battle of things. Again, running with that very Norse esoteric sort of concept. This one, well, we'll just get right into it. He brings back something to the overall Branikald equation that hadn't really been a part of their sound since their very early demos. That being clean vocals, which are a major component of this release and somewhat resemble Fenri's work with Isengard, but in a much darker, more skaldic sounding context. A lot of people don't like them, but I think they actually add quite a bit to the album's texture, particularly when he switches between clean and harsh depending on the atmosphere of the guitar riffs going on underneath. During this album's very mystical opening riff, he had those wandering, mystical kind of vocals. Now that we've switched to a more hostile sounding, kind of heroic but also violent and dark sort of riff set, he leans way harder onto the harsher end of the spectrum. Also, the rhythmic innovations from the prior two albums have reached their full flowering here, with this sort of rolling cadence that's entirely new to Branikald, and actually very much resembles the Graveland bounce I detailed on last week's Sacramentary Abolishment episode. As you're hearing right now, it's still definitely recognizable as Branikald, including those so very important unraveling sections that kind of end each song, but it's definitely a different side of Branikald than we've ever heard before. Given the preponderance of clean vocals on the album, you would be forgiven for thinking that this might be Branikald kind of wimping out or lightening up. In fact, very much the opposite. This might be the darkest sounding Branikald album, at least on songs like Dobliste Duhu, To the Spirit of Valor. I mean, that riff has to be one of the darkest and coldest things Kaldrad ever penned. And far from detracting from the music, I think his blend of clean vocals and harsher shouts actually fits the very deranged, emotionally fraught quality of this darker riffing style. At times, the clean vocals might seem a little off-key. I prefer to think of them more as just kind of being unmoored from the music, sort of left to twist in the wind, almost semi-independent of what's going on underneath it, in a way that befits the very combative atmosphere of this album. As far as them being like terribly off-key, I wouldn't say they're really that much more outre sounding than Fenri's vocals on Isengard's two albums. And if you can't handle Isengard, just get lost. I don't think our tastes in black metal are going to align much at all, and I'm surprised you've made it this far into the Branikald series. But hey, thanks for sticking with it, because as out there and crazy as this album is, as different as it is from every other Branikald release prior, Ravished by the Battle of Things is itself another transitional album, and you could definitely hear that the farther you get into it. It seems like they're hinting at something even more to come afterwards. Like on this song from the middle of the album, The Spirit of Superiority, they've got this rolling, almost tribal drum beat that's entirely new to Branikald, combined with, at the end of each riff phrase, Kaldrad hitting the higher notes of a bar chord in a very Hammerheart Bathory-esque manner. It almost sounds like an alternate history version of Branikald, where he really used songs like A Crushing Hammer and A Storm Ride off the first demo as the principal jumping point for their sound. And yes, as you get farther into the song, the darker sort of riffs come out, and it sounds a little bit more normal Branikald-ish, albeit again with very truncated, concise phrases compared to what you're used to hearing from Blazeburg Hall bands. This style would be introduced gradually on this album, and then it would reach its full flowering point on the next and final Branikald album, which is by far the most,
Nobody knows who stole the chicken.
of all Branikald's output. I mean, it's literally called Triumph Voli, Triumph des Villains, Triumph of the Will, named after the friggin' Lenny Riefenstahl film. This one, probably the least well-loved Branikald album as far as fans of the classic material go. In fact, it's probably the most hated. But to me, this one might actually be my second favorite Branikald album, after, of course, Hladvazor, Blick I've Called, or Vision of Frost, whatever you want to call album number 9. In some respects, it might actually be the best starting point for getting into Branikald's discography as far as new listenership goes, because the production this time around is a lot less raw black metal. being a whole lot cleaner and less staticky and fuzzy. Also the vocals. They're still cleaner like they were on the prior album, but they lean much less into that sort of deranged wailing and more into a slightly more appealing sounding shout. But lest we think that they sold out, they actually still have a whole bunch of really good ambient riffs, like the one you're hearing right now. They've repurposed that ambient sound in this new, much more rock against communism style context, with the very Graveland style tribalist drumming, and of course these awesome fucking shouted vocals. Easily my second favorite performance from Kaldrad ever, after of course his inevitable performance on the Hladvazor album, which I might remind you only came out a couple years prior to this one. It seems a lot longer. But check out this part, bringing back that ambient riff from earlier for, again, the all-important unraveling section, letting you know that, yeah, it might be a little cleaner, but this shit's still fucking Branikald, doing what Branikald does best, which is make great ambient black metal. Like, I gotta think, especially parts like the one you're hearing right now, this shit must have influenced shit like Druidic and Hate Forest, right? Something about that very bittersweet chord voicing just feels eminently Slavic to my ears. But speaking of the ambient music, we got a clean guitar ambient track on this album, okay? They didn't sell out. It does its, you know, type thing.
And we like that.
But my favorite ambient track on this album actually does something entirely new, combining distorted black metal guitar drone with that sort of floating ambience, as well as the very elegiac, skaldic sort of narrative clean singing, and a wonderful little package called Raven Fierce at the midpoint of the album that apparently everybody in Branikald thought was fucking sick too, because it was one of the tracks chosen to represent Branikald on the Hammer Creek Blazebirth Hall compilation. It starts out very bass heavy in its production, both in terms of the frequencies and the primacy of the instrument itself, with Kaldrad's aforementioned elegiac, skaldic, mostly wordless vocals kind of floating over all of it. This track also features the closest thing to the sort of ambient black metal layered guitar abstraction per the Hladvazor album on this release, but again with a much cleaner sort of production job, which actually works to the track's advantage because it lets you hear the bass guitar really well, and the bass lines tend to be a lot busier than is usual for Branikald. Again, actually reminded me a lot of Isengard. And then in the last third of the song, the drums kick back in with a very Berzimic-styled ambient drum beat. The vocals also come back. They're a lot more in-your-face, a little bit more hostile sounding, but still, you know, cleanly sung, and honestly, for Branikald, quite catchy. Big fan of that Raven Fierce song, and I can see why they chose to represent themselves with that on that compilation. It's also an interesting sort of inversion of the typical, rather nihilistic mode of Branikald songwriting, where usually songs will start out very black metal, and then towards the end they sort of unravel and infer themselves just into drone notes without any real like drumming rhythmic component. Raven Fierce starts out very droning and eventually straightens itself up with a very triumphant sounding drum-led section towards its end. So yeah, there's some cool ambient shit going on in this album too. Should satisfy any Branikald fan, even if it exists in a slightly different form than all their other albums. But the bulk of the black metal itself on this album very much exists in that post-Graveland sort of triumphant black metal mode. In fact, as far as post-Graveland black metal goes, I feel like Kaldrad Branislav probably understood what Rob Darkin was trying to do with Thousand Swords better than almost any other active black metal musician, and he built on that in a very interesting way. But at the same time, he didn't really compromise Branikald's creative voice either. And he incorporated all these cool new tricks, like the very dreamlife, wordless, clean vocals going on in the background here, underneath his more ranting style vocals. This is also a cool counterpoint to the riff that started the song off, and it maintains that really epic sort of triumphal feel that colors this album more than almost any other component. Triumph Voli, Triumph des Villains, Triumph of the Will, whatever you want to call it. Awesome fucking Branikald album. This project definitely went out on a high note. But more than that, it also kind of set the stage for Kaldrad's post-Branikald project, Nitberg, which featured the same drummer from Branikald, Ransverdi, and Ulf Gegner Irmansson from Raven Dark and Varglide. I'll probably have to do a Nitberg episode someday, because if you like later Branikald, you're going to love Nitberg. But no matter what era of Branikald you're talking about, at least to my ears, we're talking about some of the best black metal music, and if you haven't checked out every Branikald album, you should really get on that. Hopefully hopefully I've managed to convince you of the wisdom of that course of action over the course of these 3 episodes. But even if I haven't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Pretty damn amazing is howling. Damn amazing, holy howl. So I went